Good evening, everyone. Morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching this. We are continuing with 26 Keys to Higher Awareness, Swami's marvelous little succinct pamphlet about how to live your life successfully. We are now up to number 5, and we have come through the saga of getting your physical body in order. For the last 3 or 4, we went through exercise, breathing, posture, and food. Last week was particularly amusing. If you didn't hear it, you might enjoy it. I don't know why, but we all felt like laughing. So we did. Today we're talking about number 5, which says, oops, nope, we're not talking about number 5. We're talking about number 6, which says, be keenly interested in everything. Don't wait for things to make you interested. Awareness is not so much a matter of what one is aware of as of what he is aware with. Make interest in things a matter of deliberate, conscious practice. If you tell yourself, I'll become interested when I can find something that awakens my interest, you'll find yourself becoming progressively bored with everything. Always be open instead to new possibilities, new ideas, and new points of view. I was in New York City recently, just as a mental exercise. I wonder when I was in New York City. This is being filmed in July. I was in New York City at the end of June, so it wasn't very long ago. Swami Kriyananda once stood in front of a group of people and talked about that Asha recently went to Oregon, and then went on to talk about the things that had happened in Oregon. And he said that in California, and all my friends from Oregon quite irate with me that I'd gone all the way up there and I hadn't bothered to see any of them, and I told them that it had been 7 years ago. But Swami's sense of time was very fluid. Actually, all just because I'm going there. Very early on, Swami Ji had me come over. He had Devi and I come over and clean his house. He had us come to do that just to have us around, really. It was just a generous gesture on his part to give us a way to have a reason to be in his house and be in his house for a long time. And so for periods of time, every once in a while, I would clean his house. And when I became his secretary, I didn't so much do housekeeping. This was all in the 70s. I didn't do housekeeping so much, but I kept his things in order. Lots of his things, but also his office and everything related, a lot of things related to his service. And I remember once, at that time, if you ever visited Ananda Village, Crystal Hermitage, the living room of Crystal Hermitage is a dome. And it's one big room with a rounded walls and ceiling like that. And when Swamiji first built his house in 1971, the entire house was just that dome. And during that time he had partitions. Nothing went all the way to the ceiling, but there were these partitions. So the kitchen was partitioned off from the office, and then he had a bathroom and a sleeping loft. The bathroom was completely enclosed, but above it there was a sleeping loft. But you were still always in one room. And I remember he was taking a nap in his loft. It was sometime in the middle of the day. And I was straightening up his office, and he had a little bronze bowl that had in it kumkum powder, which was, I believe, this red powder from India that women used to mark their foreheads, and married women used to mark the part in their hair, at least in Bengal, to indicate that they're married women. And he would use it for Kriya. He would put his finger in there, and then he would touch us at the spiritual eye, and he would leave the mark there. And at that time, he gave Kriya. He was the only one who gave Kriya, and he gave Kriya every 6 months, sometimes even only once a year. So the kumkum powder was in this bronze bowl, and it was just sitting up on the shelf in his office where his bookshelves were. And I, being a sort of button-down type, is the only way I could think about it, I wanted to take that powder out of its bowl. I wanted to put it in a jar. I wanted to label it and seal it. I wanted to wash the brass thing. I wanted to put it all away. And he must have heard me or read my mind, just as likely. And I had my hand on the bowl and I was ready to take it down. And his voice comes from the loft where I thought he was napping. leave that there, Asha, I'm using it. That was his phrase. But it was extremely instructive to me because I was so linear. And this was July, and it wouldn't be taken off the shelf again until January or whatever. That to me was not using it. But for Swamiji, it was part of the ongoing flow of his energy. And therefore, he saw no reason to cut it off. It was there because whenever he could reach for it and then use it. But it was also just his point of view about time and life. Cleaning house, you learn a lot of things. Well, to our topic about being interested, I was in New York City. This is the last day of July, Guru Purnima actually, full moon in July 2012, and I was in New York in the last week of June of this year. And it happened to be one of the days we were there was International Yoga Day, June 21st or something like that. It was a Sunday. And we had been guest minister, perhaps at the Unity Church or Center for Spiritual Awareness. I think it was the Unity Church. And after we finished our program, and we was, someone from California came, and then we had a whole crowd of East Coasters with us. And because it was National Yoga Day in Times Square in New York, they hundreds of people come and they do yoga postures all day long. So we thought it was pretty nifty. We would go out to Times Square and we would watch hundreds of people do yoga postures. Why not? So we wandered over there, and there were about 4 or 5 of us, and they were all doing their poses in their ways, and we were standing there, and so I said, we'll do the tourist pose. And with the Ananda yoga postures, there's an affirmation for every posture because it has a certain mental attitude that goes with it. The people in Times Square weren't doing our affirmations, but of course we would. Let's do the tourist pose, and the affirmation is, I am interested in everything. And so then there's this picture. There were 4 of us, and we were all posed, and we're standing there, and you can see the yoga people behind us. And what was so charming is we all have this look of bright curiosity about what's going on around us. My friend made me a cup, an I Love New York cup, and put pictures on it. Right in the big in the front is the 4 of us doing the tourist pose, just like that. And now, we were joking, but not really. I'm not a city person. I'm not a real urban person, although I've lived in suburban area, Palo Alto area for almost 30 years. Prior to that, I lived in the woods of Ananda Village and swore I'd never come out of the woods again. But I'm definitely not a New Yorker, although it was a joke. I went to New York a year earlier, and everybody's very concerned because New York is not exactly a mellow place. That's not how you would think about it, and I hadn't been in New York for at least 30 years. I was there with Swamiji a long time in the 70s. I mean, I was there for a few days in the 70s. But that was all. But I said when I got there, by that point, I've been in Bangalore and Chennai and Calcutta and Delhi and Mumbai. And I said, compared to those cities, New York is just like, it's like being out in the country virtually. It's just, there's nothing going on in New York that India can't top 1,000 times. I remember when we brought a friend of ours from Calcutta to California for the first time, and we took him, he was visiting us here in Palo Alto, and so we went up to San Francisco, which isn't far away. And we were standing on the Marin County side of the Golden Gate Bridge watching all the cars go by. It's actually it's quite beautiful there. But he turned to us and he said, where are the people? Because in Calcutta, with a bridge like that, you wouldn't just see automobiles, you would see so many people. People walking, people on bicycles, people pushing carts, occasionally people on animals, but certainly people on scooters. And there would just be this mass of humanity, some of it motorized, but much of it just moving across. And I never thought about that. I'm just standing here looking at the bridge, and I said, well, they're all inside the cars. It's just like everything is so tidy in our world. So even New York City, which of course has a lot more people on the street, it really can't hold a candle to the big Indian cities. So it was pretty easy, and I enjoyed it. But even more than that, enjoyment is a deliberate act of will. Enjoyment is, I'm going to find this interesting. And that's where we were saying, this is the tourist pose. What is it to be a tourist? You go someplace that isn't the place where you naturally live. And the reason you're going is because some part of you imagines that you're going to have an experience you want to have. So do you go and sit in that experience and decide the whole time whether or not you're really going to have a good experience? Or do you start out by saying, I am interested in everything, and I'm interested in everything is so much of a more beneficial way to view it. Now, I'm going to go a lot farther into this. That was just a more or less amusing beginning. But standing there in Times Square, it wasn't Sophic. Let's just put it that way. You know, Times Square is, I don't know what it used to be like, but now with all of this electronic stuff, so you have not only billboards like there always were, but you have moving billboards. You have little video things going on, and all of it's going on at 20, up in the air, but 20-foot persons, and models and switching, and it's just huge. And even when the people aren't moving around, all the electronic stuff is moving around. So there's no possible capacity to find peace outside of yourself. You have to find it inside yourself. Now, and so it would be very easy to not enjoy it, not find it interesting. I'm going to shift over to a woman wrote Swami Kriyananda a letter once, and she was saying that essentially she was looking for where she belonged. She was looking for her purpose in life. It wasn't a question of her spiritual path because she was already well set on her spiritual path, but how was she supposed to serve? Should she do this? Should she do that? And she said to Swamiji very directly, nothing interests me. Even more deeply, nothing inspires me. She says, I just keep waiting for something to inspire me so that I can really get involved in it. But nothing seems to inspire me. Now, inspire, interest, they're not dissimilar words. And Swamiji wrote back to her very definitely. I actually think that this letter may even be included in his book of letters, in Divine Friendship, which is a wonderful collection of letters that Swamiji has written over decades. But he said to her quite simply, he said, nothing will interest you. You're waiting for the world to give you energy. And he said, as long as you're waiting for the world to give you energy, it's not going to give you any energy. He said, you have to first give energy to the world. You have to give energy to something. And then in the giving is when the magnetism will happen. If you're passive, it's not magic. It's not superstition. It's not like something's going to come in front of you and then just wake you up. You have to be engaged in a flow of energy before that energy will really take hold. In the same context, because I was talking about New York, at one point Swamiji made a slideshow with music. It was called Different Worlds. I think it's available in some form or another. It's definitely worth looking for and finding. He took many photographs for a number of years. He used to always carry a camera around the world with him. And he put a slideshow together of people's faces. And he took just people's faces all over the world. And a lot of faces of people who had lost interest in everything a long time ago. And then he progressively added in faces of people who were spiritually inspired. And the slideshow is about how we all live in different worlds and how much more satisfying the spiritual world is. But one of the pictures he had was people standing on the subway in New York, just standing there waiting for their commute time to be up. I was on the subway some, so I got a little bit of a feeling for that. And he was talking about how he would watch people get on the subway, and it would be like they would just disappear. It wasn't like they would go inward into deep meditation. They would just disappear. They just turn off their consciousness as much as they could. And then when they would get to their stop, they would wake up and come out of it again. And he said, well, it's understandable there's not that much on the subway that perhaps you want to relate to. But the difficulty is, he says, it becomes a habit. It becomes a habit when you're confronted with something that it would take energy for you to relate to, that instead of relating to it, you just don't. You just close off. That's where Swami said, if you habitually, how did he put it exactly? I'll become interested when I can find something that awakens my interest, If you tell yourself that, you'll find yourself becoming progressively bored with everything. And that's what you see on those habitual commuters. They're just bored. But when you lose the capacity to be interested, even when interesting things come to you, you've gotten into the habit of being bored. You've gotten into the habit of not putting out energy. So Swamiji wrote to this woman, you have to give energy to it first. And as you give energy to it, then energy will begin to flow. And as energy begins to flow, it's energy itself that gives you the capacity to be interested. When you give no energy to something, of course it's dull, because you're not doing anything. That's why standing in Times Square, we decided we would be tourists, and we would find everything interesting. Everything is interesting to me. And because of that, we were just very bright and engaged, and everything was very interesting to us because it was a deliberate effort of will. And here's another part of it, which is related, and it takes the whole thing a step deeper. When I first came to Ananda in 1971, and when I first met Swami Kriyananda in 1969, prior to that, I met Swami when I was 22, and just before I turned 19 is when I became engaged in the path of self-realization. But my introduction to the path of self-realization was through Swami Vivekananda. Vivekananda was a disciple of Ramakrishna Paramhansa. Ramakrishna was an avatar who lived in the 1800s outside of Calcutta in India. He never left India. Vivekananda was also Indian. He came to America for a few short years around the turn of the 1900s, around the turn of the century there. But most of his life was in India, and he died very young, so he didn't have a long life in any place. But a book of his was given to me, and I was totally magnetized to it. It was the beginning of my spiritual life. And I became very engaged with Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. I never took initiation. The clarity of being a disciple never really, I didn't get there. So I didn't really think about it, but I was very engaged with Ramakrishna. And for the 3 years until I met Swami Kriyananda, I felt deeply guided by Ramakrishna. Just like he was taking care of me, and I was very conscious of that. So when I met Swami Kriyananda, and I was just instantly and totally magnetized to him, but I didn't know anything about Yogananda. In fact, I had tried to read Autobiography of a Yogi, and I wasn't able to read it. It was Vivekananda had inspired me to become very austere. I had an extremely austere attitude toward the spiritual path. I had to learn devotion from Swamiji. So I didn't want to have anything phenomenal, is how I thought about it. I just wanted this sort of straight Vedanta philosophy, this neti, not this, just world rejecting. I was small and tight and tense and intense. That was how I was. So I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and it's, Master's just overflowing with devotion and with enthusiasm, and Lahiri Mahashaya materializes in a wheat field. I believe it's on page 9. I mean, it's very early in the book, and it just was like, I just didn't want to have anything to do with it. It just seemed too far off what I considered to be the right track. But when I met Swami Kriyananda, I didn't have any of that. He took me completely by surprise, Swami Kriyananda did. He'd been recommended, that's why I went to hear him. But his entire being, I was just amazed. I'd never, in a dim theoretical way, I knew that a person, in a theoretical way, with a very dim image of it, is what I want to say, I knew that a person could be completely different than the ordinary ego-based human being. But when I actually saw someone who was so completely different, dumbfounded. I was completely overtaken. I was thrilled, and I made an instant resolution that he has what I want, and I'm going to be where he is. because it's the only thing that interests me, the only thing I care about. And he was a disciple of Yogananda. So one thing led to another. I went back to Autobiography of a Yogi, and I couldn't understand why I didn't like it before. It's just Swamiji had opened channels in me that weren't there before, and I loved it. Still, I had this pre-existing loyalty to Ramakrishna and gratitude, and I didn't want to be fickle, because it was Ramakrishna who awakened me to the path and had taken care of me. And now that I was in front of Swami Kriyananda and that was going to lead somewhere else, Swami was very clear about the fact that we would not become his disciples, but that we were following Yogananda in following him. So I was faced with a conundrum, because I didn't want to turn my back on Ramakrishna. He'd never let me down, but I definitely wanted to follow Kriyananda, and Kriyananda was going to take me through Yogananda, and I was sort of stuck. But I was going to move to Ananda, that was for sure, because I absolutely was going to move to Ananda, because that's where Kriyananda lived. If he'd lived in Antarctica and I would have had to get my own igloo, I would have done it. I was just going to be where he was. It didn't matter. But I didn't know how to sort out this guru question. Not at all. And this is, thank God, what came to me in the moment. It was, well, this whole question of who is my guru, what path do I belong to, what should I do with my life, what is my purpose, what should I be part of? All of these questions which people are always struggling with. The reason we don't know, the reason the answer is not clear to us, is because our intuition is clouded. If we had clear intuition, we would just see it and we would know it. I obviously had that intuition about Kriyananda, but I didn't have it about the rest of the story around him. I followed the part I knew, but I didn't know the rest of it. And it seemed important to know. But I wasn't going to know until I had better intuition. So how am I going to get better intuition? Well, I'm not going to get better intuition by sitting here and worrying about the question. It's just that that's just not going to do anything to change my consciousness, which is what's required here. But I know that Yogananda's path is a true path. And therefore, if in following Swami, I follow Yogananda's path with wholehearted energy and absolute faith in it, it will change me. And when I am changed, I will have clear intuition. And if that clear intuition becomes, oh, this was temporary and you really belong with Ramakrishna, I'll know then. But I'll never know if I stand on this side of the question waiting to be certain. And I just threw myself in wholeheartedly. And I said to Ramakrishna and Yogananda just very directly, you guys have to sort this out. I said, I don't know where I belong or what I'm supposed to do. I'm doing the part that I can see, which is I need to be where Kriyananda is, and you guys sort out the rest of it. And I just trusted that. And about a year later, I was living at Ananda, and I just woke up one morning and I said, of course you belong to this path. And it was just done, just like that, without any angst, without any hesitation. I just waited until my intuition was there. Well, this is what Swami was talking about, energy and interest. And when he was talking to this woman, he didn't take it all the way to the point of intuition, but of course that's what applies, because intuition is awakened when we put out energy. I mean, for a number of reasons. One is, when we're not putting out energy, the very quality of intuition, you see, is dependent upon high energy. And the very quality of intuition is dependent upon a willingness to accept new realities and not be clinging or stuck in the realities that we already have. I mean, why are we not interested in things? Because we're just wanting things the way that they usually are. You know, sometimes people travel and they'll only compare what they see to what they have at home. Sometimes Americans, for some reason, seem especially bad at this. Maybe it's just because I understand their language. You know, this coffee in here is pretty good, but it's really not as good as the coffee that we get, right on Main Street where I live. I don't know why they serve it in these little cups, you need a bigger cup. It's just like, why are you traveling? What is the affirmation that goes with the tourist pose?
right, interested in everything. But the mind that just isn't, and takes every new experience and tries to fit it back into the experiences it's already had, and compare and contrast and usually criticize, that attitude will never be intuitive either. Because intuition is when new realities come together. So Swamiji, to go all the way back to this letter, just said, get engaged. Just, it doesn't matter which of these things you do, just do them. Start doing it. And in the doing of it, first of all, your energy will raise, you'll be putting out more energy. Plus, and this is a very interesting aphorism, that pithy truth that has always been a part of the Ananda reality, which is, energy has its own intelligence, which is an interesting phrase, and it's worth thinking about. What that means is when you start putting out energy, the energy itself has a consciousness. And once you start putting out energy, the energy that you're putting out will itself guide you. I mean, one thing leads to another is a simple way of saying it. Or you get a little experience, and then that experience gives you some way of comparing and contrasting what you're doing and understanding sort of what the next step might be. But standing in one place and wondering where it's going to lead, there's not any energy flowing, and you don't get the benefit of the intelligence that the energy has. That's why we often say, just put out energy. It doesn't really matter what you put it into as long as you put the energy out. Because once you start putting energy out, energy has its own intelligence. You will start having experiences. You will come up against your own shortcomings. You'll be forced to use your willpower to overcome those shortcomings. You will become a better, more refined person. You will have better intuition. And you'll also have a lot more fun. Being keenly interested in everything. How else does he put it there for a moment? He also says awareness is not so much a matter of what one is aware of as of what he is aware with. And that's sort of what we've been talking about. There's that's a kind of creativity that comes with being interested in things, where we're always able to sort of learn something new, feel something that we haven't felt before, and also having the mind itself become flexible. This is why people, they talk about it now in terms of staving off Alzheimer's, but to all the different things that you can do crossword puzzles, learn a new language. There's a whole huge project called Lumosity, which a lot of the people of my stage of chronological development, which is what we call ourselves now, practice. And it's a whole set of things that you do on the computer, and it's all these different exercises, games that you play, that train your mind in all these different ways. And they say it keeps your mind from atrophying, which is a pretty obvious thing, isn't it? But the point, regardless of Alzheimer's, is we either gradually run out of steam as our life progresses, or we remain fresh and interested and alive until the last breath is there. My father was an interesting man. He wasn't spiritually inclined in any overt way, but he was a good man. He had a very good heart, and he was very interesting because this is one thing that he had really trained himself to do. At some point in his life, he made the decision that he would always be interested in everything. And he was very Virgo in his nature, and so he was often very interested in the minutiae of everything. But nonetheless, he could go almost anywhere, and he would always find something that interested him. And as I grew older and began to understand sort of what he was doing, it was a deeply admirable quality. And interestingly, at the end of his life, the last couple of years of his life, he became mentally diminished. He was a very intelligent, intellectually oriented man. And you would have thought to have lost that kind of intellect would have been a really bad thing for him. But it was very interesting to me
that his essential nature of being interested in things just carried him through. And even though he couldn't, he lost the capacity to make intelligible speech. He didn't lose the capacity to speak, but I don't know what he thought he was saying. But what he was saying was not usually an actual logical interaction and conversation. He would say things, and I would say things, and we'd talk. And sometimes I could kind of intuit what he was trying to say. And I would just converse with him as if he had answered me in a sensible manner, and we would just go on like that. But the quality that he had cultivated of interest, and what went with it in his case was also appreciation, made him, well, the only word I can use is delightful. He was just delightful because wherever he looked, he saw something to be interested in and appreciate. All on a level that, people become quite anxious when they see people who have lost their intellectual capacity. There was a great disciple of masters of Paramahansa Yogananda's. Her name is Kamala Silva. She's passed away now. And Kamala met Master when she was just a teenager. Her mother was devoted to Yogananda, and in the 20s, her mother met Master, and then Kamala and her mother became dear friends of Master, not really students, but friends. He would often come and stay in their house, and so she knew him from a very young age, and was completely devoted to him her entire life. She eventually married, and then she ran a center for Master in Oakland. And it was the center that she ran that actually was the seed that resulted in the Richmond Temple that Self-Realization Fellowship had. They've now let go of that building, and they're somewhere in motion to build another. But it was she who was responsible for building the magnetism there that resulted in that temple. And I never knew her, but I've read her books, The Flawless Mirror and Priceless Precepts, and she was a beautiful soul and deeply devoted. And she had made the amazingly courageous prayer to Master that all her karmic debts be paid in this lifetime. We would often talk to one another about whether we had the nerve to make that prayer. And she prayed that all her karmic debts would be settled. Why postpone it? Let's pay it off now. And so toward the end of her life, she lost her mental acuity. And she completely lost her short-term memory, and she could no longer relate in the way that people are accustomed to relating in an intelligent way. She never lost her ability to speak coherently like my father did. Or maybe she did at the very end, but she could speak coherently, but she just couldn't understand what was going on around her. She vividly remembered Master, though. She always remembered Master. But when I heard, and for a while we took care of her at another village. And when Swamiji told me that Kamala was there and that Kamala had lost her mind, well, being an intellectual sort of person, this was before I went through it with my father, I said, Swami, she's lost her mind. It was just so horrifying to me. And he looked at me and said, it's just her mind, like that. And it just, we did not. I just heard him say it, but I just didn't know what to think about it. But when I met Kamala, which I did only once, but all she lost was her mind. She said, tell me your name, and I'll immediately forget it, but you might as well tell me. And she didn't really know exactly where she was, and she just didn't know a lot of things. But she still, how shall I say it, she was intensely interested in everything. She had lived a life in which she was always giving out. She was always helping people. She was always trying to be an instrument of Master. She was always trying to see Master everywhere. And a lifelong habit of just giving out joyous energy and being intensely enthusiastic and interested in everything, she lost her mind. It didn't make any difference. Her essential, expansive, joyous character remained absolutely intact. There was a story that I was told later. She eventually was moved by her family. She was taken away from Ananda and moved by her family into a care facility, which I'm told wasn't the most uplifting facility. And the view out her window was a parking lot,
But she just decided that the view out her window was beautiful. And maybe she was hallucinating, but she thought she was somewhere in the Himalayas, and she had always loved animals, and she thought that all her stuffed animals were living animals, and she took care of them all. I mean, looking at it, you think it could be alarming. But on the other hand, when all deliberate intellectual process, the capacity to deliberately choose your attitude was taken away from her,
what was left spontaneously was this lifetime of goodness. And really, what do we want? Because
we are what we are instinctively, spontaneously. I'm going to finish this thought first with my father, and then I want to come back to that. And I watched my father, not on the level that Kamal had, because Kamal remembered being a disciple of Master and remembered Master, and of course my father didn't have that context. But interestingly with him, he'd always felt that it was necessary as the conscientious head of the family to worry about a lot of things, and to always make sure that everybody had covered every little Virgo aspect of everything. It just drove him crazy. And when he lost his intellect,
he forgot all about that. He forgot
to worry. He forgot to be always in charge and making sure that everybody was doing what they were
supposed to do. And just this delightful
affection for everything just came out of him. It was so dear. I'm just going to tell you one silly story just because it was so funny when it happened. You know, when people lose their intellect, a lot of things you take for granted are not there anymore. And I got a call from the people who were caring for him, and they were very agitated. And the first thing that they said, this was not very good public relations, they should have thought it out better. The first thing they said to me was, "We called poison control, and it's not a problem." What? What are you talking about? Well, it had turned out that they were having their meal family style in this place where he was living. And after my father ate the potatoes and the fish or whatever else was there, he ate the flower arrangement. Because it was on the table in a bowl. And to him it looked like the sweet potatoes. He didn't know the difference. And he didn't really have much capacity to taste, so he just ate the flower arrangement. And they had called poison control. Fortunately, it wasn't oleander or anything like that. It was fine, and he was fine. As soon as I understood it, I just started to laugh. I thought it was just so endearing. And of course, when I started to laugh, they started to laugh, because in the privacy of their own quarters, they had already laughed. But they had to be really serious when they were talking to me, because they didn't know how I would respond. But why not? The flowers are beautiful, and he just ate the flowers. You know, once you let go of how things are supposed to be, and how you're supposed to put yourself forward, just this dear childlike quality. And so often people are, I will say, are not actually genuinely interested in things because they're trying to be astute. We're trying to be shrewd, and we're trying to be cunning, we're trying not to be taken in. And we just forget about just being simple and childlike. Now there was something else I was going to, now I have to find it because I put it off to come here. Oh, rats. Perhaps I'll come back to it, perhaps I won't. Now see, a lot of, also, do we have a question? I put out a piece of paper that has a blank on it. Doesn't say one. Okay. Because I forgot to get a pen. All right. Why don't we pause and let's take questions since I can't remember what I was going to say. Willful enjoyment and appreciation becomes self-delusion if you're insincere. I mean, when I say willful enjoyment, I mean, I think the vocabulary of the question is a little confused, but it's not that you pretend to be interested, it's that you are interested. You see, that's the difference. And you're interested in this sense, which is, show me something in creation that isn't a manifestation of the Spirit. Everything around us is a manifestation of the Spirit, and everything around us can teach us something. It's not like we can't learn. I mean, even just, there we were in Times Square, and all these people in this insane, unusual place, which is Times Square. It's unique on the planet, I believe. And all these people are dressed in their yoga clothes, doing yoga postures, and the sound system had broken at the time we were there, so we had all these yoga teachers all were walking around like drill sergeants, sort of saying, because the leader couldn't be heard. So they had all these, they were walking around, and everybody was doing all of this, and it was just like, what a circus.
What a fascinating zoo this is.
You know, everybody's got their piece of it. And all these people were very sincere, men and women of many different ages and body types and appearances and races and ethnicities, because after all it was New York City. Just to stand back and just see what a fascinating planet this is. I can look out my window and there's some kind of a plant. I don't know what kind of a plant it is. It's on the edge of the pond, and it's a long, skinny, straight thing. And it's like dragonflies.
It's like that. And
dragonflies are just this really unusual thing. You can just stand there and watch these dragonflies, and the consciousness in a dragonfly is the same consciousness that I have. It's just, we're both manifestations of the same Satchidananda. It just doesn't have as highly developed a nervous system or intellectual capacity, but the same spark of divinity is there, the same desire to experience happiness on its own level and to escape suffering. It's all there. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. Standing there in Times Square, just looking at all the people and thinking how every single person is so real to himself or herself. And every one of us makes perfect sense to ourselves. Even though you can look at it from the outside and think, how did you ever think that was a good idea? How did you ever think that those particular yoga pants were really the ones that you should be wearing? Like, did you see yourself before you left home this morning? It's just like, and that's on the smallest level. But from inside that person, there was an inevitable logic that led exactly to that point. And it's so, one of the things I enjoyed about New York is I found it very stimulating spiritually to be surrounded by so many possibilities and to realize what Maya is like and how it can just go on and on and on. And everybody's just following their own trajectory, including me, and just feeling part of this amazing reality. I was with Swami Triyananda once at Disneyland. Swamiji used to like to go to Disneyland in the 70s and maybe a little into the 80s. There was a point, maybe it was after Walt Disney died, or after enough time passed after Walt Disney died, when Disneyland used to be a completely imaginary world. It was the characters that were from his stories, and you went there and it did not connect to the popular culture, except insofar as much of what Walt Disney created became popular, with Mickey Mouse and Snow White and Seven Dwarfs and all of that. But it did not look to the popular culture to bring it in. At a certain point, because everything has its flowering and then its passing, whoever was in charge began to look to the popular culture and to bring the popular culture in. And music changed, and entertainment changed, just everything changed. So we didn't enjoy it anymore. But he used to really enjoy it because it was innocent, and it was so creative, and it was so beautifully done. So we were there. Actually, there were about 14 of us. I think we'd gone to Los Angeles for some kind of a spiritual fair, and then we'd stayed an extra day to go to Disneyland. And we had been chasing Swami all through Disneyland. Swami knew the place very well, and he knew what he liked to do and where he wanted to go. And as soon as we finished with one exhibit or one ride, he would just be off to the next one, and we would be literally running to keep up with him, sometimes holding hands through the crowd. It was really quite a lark. And in the evening there, and I believe they still have this, they had something called the Electric Parade, where all the Disney characters and these floats would come down Main Street
and they would all be electrified. They would be wearing lights. And it was very beautiful. Just, from a astral, what would the astral world be like if we were all made of light sort of point of view. So we wanted to get a good seat, so we came down a little early and were staking out our particular place on the sidewalk, right where we had a good view. And Swamiji went into a very deep bhav. A bhav is like a spiritual mood. And he went into this bhav, and it was more unusual in those days for him to, not for him to have those experiences, but he tended to keep them under wraps. The last 10 years of his life, he would let them out all the time. But it was a little unusual for him to let it out. It was always there. He was always the same, but he kept it a little under wraps. He had too much work to do. So we're there, and we're just sort of looking out over the crowd, hundreds of people from all over the planet. And Swami says, imagine, he said, not merely loving all these people, he said, but being every one of these people, being as much in their consciousness as you are in your own. And he said this was Master's state of consciousness. You know how Master said he was so much in everyone's body that he often didn't know which one he was supposed to keep going. He said he would have to ask people whether he'd eaten because he couldn't tell. He wasn't connected enough to be able to tell. And he made that comment about it when he stumbled when he was walking. He just forgot to keep moving his feet because he wasn't connected enough. And Master knew every thought that his disciples were thinking. And he said to someone once, you have a sour taste in your mouth, don't you? I mean, he just was that much in everyone's reality. So Swamiji, somehow just in that crowd, he caught that thought. Imagine not only loving every one of these people, but actually being every one of these people. And then somehow, as he said that, this a wave of that perception just came out over all of us. And we all became suddenly, from really just having a very outward, delightful, uplifting, but still very engaged sort of day. Everybody's energy just went right into the spine. And we all just sat down right on the sidewalk with Swami and just meditated. Just right there on the sidewalk in Disneyland. And we meditated about half an hour. And the only thing that woke us up was finding that the electric parade was in front of us, and the noise of that brought us out of the meditation. I mean, it was quite a moment. And when we'd sat down, there was really no one on the sidewalk. And when we woke up, we were completely surrounded because the parade had started and everyone was near us. I don't know what they thought of this group having a flash mob meditation, which would never have been heard of at that period of time. But they were just kind of, standing next to us, and we were all just sitting there like this. People are sophisticated enough to have figured out what we were doing. But then, then we came and we got engaged again. But, that's the kind of interest I'm talking about. I mean, just always being able to find in every circumstance something about it that will open your heart and uplift your consciousness. This is also, interest and compassion and sympathy and service. All of these things all go together. What are we doing? Are we always and only just thinking about ourselves? One of the things that magnetized me so powerfully from Vivekananda's book that I referred to earlier, he said these simple words: don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. That was just like a revelation to me. I was not quite 19, so my only excuse is that I was a callow youth. But I wasn't selfish. I was generous by nature, but I was utterly self-preoccupied. I was always, as I put it to myself now, I was always calculating my own advantage. Not my own advantage in the sense of putting it over others, but I always wanted to make sure that I was making the choice that would be the most fun. And I, as I said, I wasn't callously indifferent. It wasn't like I would take my
benefit at the expense of others, although, of course, I did a certain amount of that. But I was always thinking about where I stood in relation to everything. And so to think about not thinking about myself, I was stunned at the very idea. I mean, imagine. But nonetheless, I was. But it was fascinating to me when I really began to take that apart. That what makes us miserable, I mean, this is a very popular, what you would call popular spirituality. It's just the stories we tell ourselves. It's the not living in the now. I was in a situation, it was very interesting to me. The situation, there was absolutely nothing wrong in the present. Everything in the present was perfect. The only difficulty was the memory of other realities, you know, of what used to be or what might have been or who did what to whom, whatever that was. Whenever that story would come, then the present would become unpleasant. But when the story was not happening, and the story was just, as people call it now, just the story, the events were over. And it was just the story. When the story wasn't telling itself, there was nothing wrong in the present. And that's how I began to understand. This was all much before this, as I said, but it became so popular. That you feel fine until you ask yourself, how do I feel? But it's not that, now, and this is where the question comes, you know, self-deception or whatever exactly how he phrased it was. It's like you're sincerely shifting your consciousness. You're not just play acting. You actually move yourself out of yourself enough to actually be learning and listening, and you become humble enough to really, you know, find something useful. And at the very least, if really nothing around you interests you, you can become interested in the spiritual eye and the presence of God within you, which is always everywhere. Times Square, Bangalore, the middle of Ananda village, wherever you are. There was a woman who was living in our urban center in San Francisco. And for a while there, we had a little bookstore cafe. And the bookstore cafe was some miles from where the ashram was located. And it kept rather late hours. And the woman was part of the late shift, had to be part of the late shift on that business, and often had to close it up. She didn't have a car, and having a car was not practical in the situation. So she always had to take a bus home. And she was a little nervous because the business and the ashram were both in neighborhoods that she felt safe in, but the bus had to go through some neighborhoods where she felt nervous. And late at night, not everyone who gets on the bus is in the most uplifted state of mind in a city, a big city. So she was actually a little frightened about it. And she had a long discussion with Swamiji about the whole thing and what should she do. And it became obvious that she both needed to do the job, that the circumstances couldn't be shifted, and she also needed to face her fear. And Swamiji obviously felt that the fear was not based on intuition. It was just fear. So he said to her, he said, why don't you pray for people on the bus? He said, even the ones that may even frighten you the most, why don't you pray for them? He said, instead of sitting there thinking about yourself, he said, why don't you, well, let's use the word, become interested in the people around you. And then after we become interested, let's become interested in what we can give them. And the woman said that in a very short period of time, her favorite part of the day was the bus rides. Because there she was. And she just had this unbroken period of time in which she could become a channel for divine energy to flow through her. And often, we make that resolution. We decide in our meditation that that's who we're going to be. But then everything that we're doing begins to distract us. And, we're trying to be joyful and serviceful and all those things, but there's a lot of details to take care of. So there she was just sitting on the bus. There was absolutely nothing happening. And a lot of people on the bus needed to be prayed for. At least her perception of them was. So you suddenly look at someone with a completely different attitude. You're looking at them with How can I serve you? And you're also looking at them, really looking at them with God's eyes. Instead of, how are you going to hurt me? How can I protect myself from you? You look at people with the sympathy of the divine. It's a very important fact to remember. Swami Kriyananda, at a certain point of his life, for more than a decade, was persecuted intently through the legal system, years of litigation, and very, very dishonorable attorneys, very trumped-up cases, a transparent and blatant misuse of the legal system to initiate spiritual persecution. But there it was. And things weren't going so well. And people with very little honor actually had a certain power over Swami.
Very dishonorable people had power over Swami, over us. The legal system is quite complicated and not nearly as clean as we would like it to be. It can be easily manipulated against the interest of truth. And Swami had a certain crisis over this. Most of the time, he could say with great sincerity, whatever Divine Mother sends me, I accept with gratitude. But the human heart also quails sometimes in front of this. And he had a crisis, and he had a very deep, prayerful meditation. And he was saying to God and Gurus, I've only done this work for you. And if you wish to destroy the work I've done, if you wish to destroy my reputation, I just want to be your disciple. I don't care about any of it. He said, but I don't understand why you are allowing such dishonest, dishonorable people to have power over me. I mean, it was a very fair question. And Swami meditated very deeply, and he prayed to Babaji. And he said Babaji's answer to him was very profound. It was, they are all my children. And I've really had to think about that a lot. I mean, we can't help but think that God loves the ones who are good better than he loves the ones who are not so good. But all of us, until we become one with God ourselves, are in various stages of delusion, gradually moving out of delusion toward the light. And do you think that God is less pleased when someone farther down on the spectrum moves forward than he is when someone higher up on the spectrum moves forward? From the divine perspective, it's just a question of increasing awareness. And sometimes even when somebody does a wrong thing, it's actually the necessary step for them to eventually do the right thing. And why would God, who loves us all equally, not be there helping everyone? It was such a beautiful thought. They're all my children. Don't be deceived. They're all my children. Now, what is there not to be interested in? Everything in creation is Satchidananda, and every living, breathing, sentient being is a manifestation of the same consciousness. Everything is God. If we can see it outwardly, that's very powerful. And if our eyes are blinded outwardly, then we can always go within and feel that life force coursing through us. And if this becomes our habitual way of life, we can lose everything, including our mind. And it won't matter, because with every breath, that's who we will be. 26 keys to living with greater awareness of everything, and cultivating the capacity to have a healthy, open interest in everything around you, and an active ability to express that. It's a life skill worth developing. So